So, as I was saying, I've been fascinated by these Gnostic Gospels ever since I discovered them or discovered about them way back when I was doing a bit of theology. I think I may have mentioned in the past, I was my degree was a rather weird degree at Keele University. It made you do a science degree and an arts degree. Sorry, a science. If you do a science degree, it made you do an arts subsidiary subject for the first year, which they took very importantly. And I happened to take theology just because I was interested in that stuff. And it was those lessons, those parts of the course that I discovered the existence of the Gnostic Gospels. I'd heard about them, but didn't know what they really were. And every now and then I go back and look at them again, because now they're generally accessible. You can read them. So what I thought I'd do this evening is give you an overview of the Gnostic Gospels to bring you up to speed or remind you if you already knew, and then talk about one or two things I think are important. And then, of course, that opens up a possible discussion later into, what happens to suppressed materials that are actually deemed either not for public consumption or not relevant to the church, in this case, that wants to be promoted. That's a very clumsy way, but I know what I mean. So the Gnostic Gospels, what we're going to talk about briefly is the significance, the discovery, a bit of the history. And what I find fascinating about these Gospels, they are actually, they were lost for 1600 years in a desert or in the desert. And they were discovered by a farmer who was looking for some fuel for his fire. And they came across these things and so started to burn some of them before they realized it was something kind of special. So we'll talk a bit about that, and we'll talk a little bit about the content of some of the key Gospels and what they were. So they were discovered in 1945 in a place called Nag Hammadi, which is in Egypt, in the upper part of Egypt. And they kind of, they were revolutionary. They revolutionized thinking on biblical, or shall we say, religious scripture, but they also reminded us of things that we already knew. So they confirmed some stories of Christianity that we kind of knew. So he was digging. This farmer was digging in this cliff top, and actually he wasn't looking for fire. He was looking for fertilizer at the top of the cliff, and he found these earthenware jars containing 13 leather-bound papyrus codices or scripts. And, he feared that there was a jinn in the bottle, and so he broke the bottle open to release the genie or not, but to discover these texts. And inside these bottles were 52 texts written in Coptic, ancient writing, and dated between the 4th century, around about the 4th century after Christ's birth or death, actually. The original Greek texts were composed between 10 and 300 CE, quite early. They were, some of them have been, were smogged and they had been used for fuel, but there was a complicated trek of getting these texts into the museums to be studied. And the first complete English translation was available in 1977. Now that's actually discovered in 45, and 1977 was the first English translation. So these things did an interesting journey. There were arguments about provenance, there are arguments about legitimacy, there are arguments about who actually had the rights to look at these things, because they were found in Egypt, but they had a kind of going back to some sort of references to Christianity. So were they Christian documents, were they Egyptian documents, whatever. And once that argument had been resolved, they came into the hands of the scholars. So the first thing we need to consider is what we mean by the word Gnosticism. because if these are Gnostic Gospels, then it implies there is an area of belief called Gnostics or Gnosticism. And this is what attracted me, to be quite honest, to some of this stuff, because I felt a resonance with Gnostic thought. Now, as some of you probably know, that I'm sort of been interested in sort of, should we say, occult topics ever since I was a teenager. And if you read those topics, you come across these various divisions of belief systems. And Gnosticism was actually, let's call it a faction for the moment, a faction of developed thought that kind of predates Christianity, but runs alongside Christianity and creates all kinds of arguments about what is the nature of faith and what are we really doing about discovering ourselves. So what Gnosticism is about broadly, and I could, again, this is one of those topics that goes on forever. It's the idea that gnosis, personal salvation, is about spiritual knowledge, and it's not just faith. Now, if you contrast that to many scriptural teachings, both the books of the sort of biblical texts, the three major faiths, that's about believing the text. Islam, Judaism, and Christianity is about believing the texts and having faith. But Gnostics were quite a different breed of thinker. They actually wanted to ensure they understood the spiritual nature and of what was going on, and therefore knowledge, gnosis, was really important. It's not fair really to clump them all together into one big group, because there were lots of factions within it. But broadly speaking, one of the key Gnostic beliefs was that the world, the universe that we live in, the earth that we walk upon, wasn't created by God as such, but was created by the demiurge, which is actually not a nice god. It's a kind of flawed god, and the demiurge is flawed because it sought to reproduce itself. And there's a lot of stories around that, but and so the demiurge became the reason that the God of the Old Testament, okay, smote everybody, started wars, wiped out civilizations, killed men, women, and children. Because actually, if you read the Old Testament, there's a lot of smoting going on, and by the wrath of God. So the Gnostics said, well, that's because that's not the true God, that's the demiurge. The demiurge is this kind of slightly psychotic, disturbed material being or supernatural being that is flawed. And because they're flawed, if we follow the demiurge without questioning, without true understanding, we become flawed in ourselves. The Gnostics believed that there was a true God, but this true God was at a different level, different plane, different different stage to the demiurge. It was kind of like there was the true God, wonderful cosmos, and that cosmos that was wonderful and fantastic, and the truth, if you like, gave birth to this shadow, the demiurge, and we are trapped in this shadow world. What I really caught my attention early on with Gnosticism was that its firm statement that inside each one of us, no matter how flawed we are, but in each one of us is a divine spark, if you like, a connection to the true God, right? And the idea of knowledge and wisdom is to liberate that divine spark so you can connect to the true source of the creation rather than this shadowy, maladjusted, sort of not quite vibing with good feelings demiurge. And so what Gnostics were doing is they were seeking through knowledge, also through sort of spiritual techniques. They were seeking to connect with this divine. Now, I'll stop there for a moment, because I think you will actually all, I guess, recognize that idea within various strands of spirituality that sort of emerged in the West from the 60s onwards. That idea that there is a divine spark within each of us and we're all one with the cosmos, all that stuff. Well, this is kind of Gnostic thinking. The idea that with the true God, there was this sort of divine realm, and it was inhabited by aeons, spirits, guides, and the goddess Sophia was one of them, until she fell out of that space, and she, in the origin myth of all material creation, so it was her fault that we created a material plane that had all its problems it does. She tried to be like God and create, and in creation created the demiurge, and then that led to all kinds of issues. And in the Sophia stories, myths, legends, whatever you want to call them, she spends a long time trying to undo the things that she's done. Sophia, of course, means wisdom. So there's this wonderful kind of allegory here. And most early Gnostics believed that Christ, the Jesus that's in the Bible, was the revealer of the way to the truth and wasn't necessarily the truth. And you can see why it ran contrary to many early church beliefs, and particularly when the Christianity became codified and organized by Paul, the apostle, the writer Paul, and the Roman Catholic Church came about, that Gnosticism was soon seen as heresy, because Jesus wasn't just the revealer, wasn't just a speaker of a truth, wasn't just somebody who was a Gnostic, but also was a son of God. And that enters this whole sort of theological area of what that actually means. What does Son of God, Son of Man mean? And the church struggled for centuries trying to nail that down into something that the people would understand and maybe connect with. And I'm not sure many people actually do understand those phrases in the modern church, unless it's a Catholic church or one of the kind of established older churches. So Gnostic beliefs have those 6 things about them. There's a true God, a wonderful realm, the goddess Sophia, who was one of the aeons, okay, one of the angels, if you like, but that's not the right phrase, spirits, tried to create like God created, and in doing so, that gave birth to the demiurge, who then tried to create the world, and that's the world we live in. And the only way we can connect with the divine spark within us is through knowledge and wisdom. So the Gnostic Gospels were the written down belief systems of these Gnostic groups, these people that were all trying to achieve connection with the universe. And until they were discovered and really interpreted, we knew about Gnostics, we knew about the idea that there were these people that became heretics as far as the church was concerned. But one of the things that we're not often reminded of is that the early church, the church that existed shortly after Christ's death, was fragmented. And it wasn't just fragmented, it had different factions within it. And all of them tried to coexist at one time, and they all had their versions of the Revelation story, if you like. And the fact that one became the one that we've all read or been introduced to in school and goodness knows what, is because it was edited by one of the great councils of the early church, in Council of Nicaea in 6 something AD, 60 AD, where everything was codified. Everything was that's acceptable, that's not acceptable, that is part of the true story, that is part of the mythical fake story and its heresy. And of course, that was all the Roman Church asserting itself, and Constantine becoming the first Christian emperor, Roman emperor, and becoming a Christ follower because apparently he was given an illumination, some kind of divine revelation. Politically and practically, it probably makes more sense for the ruler of an empire to suddenly recognize the most dominant religion at that particular time, or the growing religion, and hoist his chariot to that. That sounds very cynical, but I think it happened kind of like that. So 15 texts across 13 codices. And what is amazing about these texts is some of them aren't actually in Greek, they're in Aramaic, which is closer to the language that Jesus and his disciples would have spoken. And when that was made public, when the Aramaic stuff, it suddenly became obvious that maybe these were closer to the true story of Jesus Christ than the biblical story of Jesus Christ. And again, a reason for them to become heretical. So one of the most important Gospels, I say important, the ones that I first came across really, was the Gospel of Thomas. It doesn't exist in the Bible, biblical canon, because it was outruled. And basically, it's not written as a story, like a narrative of the birth and the death of this character Jesus. They're his sayings. Some people suggest it may be the Thomas, the apostle, the doubting Thomas of the Bible. Other people don't think it's necessarily that, but they use that name because of the doubting Thomas story. But these 114 sayings were in the text claimed to be the original sayings of Jesus Christ, and some of them you recognize from they survived in other Gospels. But the one that is quite difficult for many Orthodox Christians to accept, or at the time it was, is that the kingdom of heaven is present now. If that's what Jesus was saying, the kingdom of heaven is present now, then what's the point of the church managing your journey back into heaven, the salvation, the rights, and all that kind of stuff? It calls that into question. And the idea that the kingdom of heaven exists now within us as well as outside of us means that the thing that's stopping us reaching that kingdom is actually ourselves. And it's not the fact that we haven't done enough penance for churches or whatever. There's a wonderful thing about, the idea that just lift a stone and I am there. So the Spirit, the true God, is there within a stone, therefore it's there within us. And all we need to do is recognize it. And I think you can see how that kind of idea does away with hierarchy, does away with the priesthood, does away with structures of clergy that need to maintain some kind of law or discipline. The idea that the spark is within all of us, it's because, well, that's the case, and what we call Jesus, or what was called Jesus, is the light at the center of all things. Again, we know that in the Gospels, the four Gospels that we are all familiar with, there is that seed of an idea, and it came into the Christian prayer, I am the way, the truth, and the light. Well, that's a Gnostic idea as well. But whereas you can only come to that light through the church, the Gnostics believe you can find that light by knowledge, by becoming aware. And the idea is that the world that we seeking to be reborn into, or the world we call heaven, that we wait for Judgment Day to take us there, is already here. And in many cases, we're just too blind to see it. Many of the other sayings in the Gospel of Thomas exist in part in the four Gospels we know, but scholars have long spoken about a fifth source material they call the Q materials. My Star Trek mind goes completely off there with the Q continuum and stuff, but bring it back. And the idea that these we have this Q collection of documents about the historical Jesus, and then we have these mystical statements coming from the Gospel of Thomas appearing in the four Gospels, is quite an interesting academic as well as spiritual thing to challenge. And in the Gospel of Thomas, we first learn the idea that Mary Magdalene wasn't necessarily just the woman who washed Jesus' feet with her hair. Mary Magdalene is the person that he kissed on the lips, which made her special. And that leads to that whole chain of thought, which you've probably seen in the Da Vinci Code and all that kind of stuff, where Mary Magdalene was married to Jesus, and they were, that was the Merovingian line of Jesus' bloodline. And the idea that Jesus' role in the Gospel of Thomas isn't about a preacher or a miracle worker or an apocalyptic prophet. He's not talking about that sort of stuff. What he's saying is a wisdom teacher. And actually, I've always felt that sits quite comfortably with me. I'm aware that the word guru often means somebody who signposts. They are not holy in themselves, but they have the ability to teach wisdom to lead us forward. And in many ways, this gospel pitches Jesus as a guru, not a guy that needs to be sacrificed in order to take away the sins of the world. And again, you can probably see how this causes problems for the official line that the church wanted to adopt. There are two gospels, one called the Gospel of Faith and the Gospel of Truth, otherwise known as the Gospel of Philip and the Gospel of Truth. And this is a series, the one is a series of meditations, well, they're both a set of meditations about living life to explore your connection and connection with the universe. There are some, in these two Gospels, there are some kind of important rites, and it's about one of the ones is the 5 sacramental rites about the bridal chamber, which may be an odd thing to think about, except in terms of some of the Gnostics, one of the most powerful beliefs was that a marriage was technically a union between your own divine counterpart, that bit of a person that had the light within them that matched your bit. And so that divine connection was important, and therefore it wasn't seen as something about betrothal. It wasn't seen as something that you need to be married. It was seen that that person is your counterpart. if I nick an Eastern idea, it's the yin and yang idea of completeness. And in the Gospel of Philip, we hear about Mary Magdalene being further described as Jesus' consort and loved more than all of the other disciples. And in this Gospel, we also read that any form of resurrection, it's not to do with a physical resurrection, it's to do with the return to the consciousness, the universal consciousness. And I think that's really important again, especially in the days of, shall we say, certain Christian sects nowadays who maintain it's the physical rebirth into the new kingdom. You know, it's that kind of the righteous will be taken away and be reborn, and it implies a material rebirth rather than a spiritual rebirth. And the idea within the Gospel of Philip, it's reinforced that if you live solely within the material world, you're getting a skewed version of what creation is. And the truth is beyond the material senses and recognition. It needs something else. It needs the wisdom of Sophia to find us way back. The Gospel of Truth is basically a series of meditations on what makes us ignorant. It talks about when the sort of heavenly creatures, the aeons, if you like, didn't know the Father, and they forgot because they were removed from the light of the universe, the cosmos, and they forgot their place and they forgot who they were. And that forgetfulness comes down to our forgetfulness on the material plane. The Gospel of Truth is actually considered by the scholars who study it, it's one of the finest pieces of theological and literary aspects of Gnostic literature. It's very well well written, well supported, and theologically sound. It just means there's a shift in perspective. Then we have the Gospel of Mary, that is possibly Mary Magdalene, and the dialogue of the Saviour. The Gospel of Mary wasn't found in the Nag Hammadi piles, but was actually purchased in 1896, wasn't published in 1955, and Greek fragments have been found since. It is often seen to be Mary Magdalene, and it describes the soul's journey through 7 cosmic powers, which are linked to the 7 planets, which we overcome those limitations through gnosis. Now, I'll just take a sidestep here. If you remember back to our discussions of the Kabbalah some time ago, to ceremonial magic some time ago, we know that the imagery of there being powers, filters, which I think is a better word, of cosmic awareness. And these filters are in the 7 things, the 7 planets, for example, the ancient astrological planets, the idea that we are repeating our learning, not so much reincarnation, but the idea that we're repeating our learning through these levels. And I think it was that, taking a big leap sideways now, that idea of the 7, repeating 7 cycles of 7, which are really interested in theology. That's what forced, I've forgotten his name now, but he'll come back to me, the guy that popularized the chakra system in the West chose 7, because there were 7 colors, 7 planets, and he would say 7 vital organs, 7 chakra wheels. And we know that in the East, chakras are any number from 3 to 400, it's not as limited as the chakra system we've been teaching in the West. There are a number of pages missing from the Gospel of Mary, which is a shame. The dialogue of the Saviour is suggested to be a dialogue between Jesus and the three disciples, Matthew, Judas, Thomas, and Mary. It concerns the soul's journey. Now, one of the things I find interesting here, it suggests that this is possibly one of the earlier texts. But if we think back to our Greek philosophers, a lot of their philosophical teachings were shared or written down as discussions between one or two other learned people. And they were manufactured discussions to get a set of ideas across. And I think the dialogue of the Saviour is kind of like that. And again, Mary is seen here as being the one who understood completely and elevated her as this sort of supreme disciple. This is possibly one of the earlier texts in the complete collection. But again, the ideas and the way it is structured certainly suggests sort of earlier influences and the way philosophers talked about these ideas. Then we have this thing called the Gospel of Judas, which is quite interesting. Judas being the character and the Christian canon, the idea that he was the betrayer. And I know when I was sort of doing my bits of religion at school, because we had to do it at school, didn't we? Judas was the guy that sold out Jesus for his 30 pieces of silver. And I, like many other people, went away with this idea that Judas was the baddie. But then a question occurred to me very early on, actually, in my thinking, that without Judas, there wouldn't have been a crucifixion, or there wouldn't have been the sacrifices, and so there couldn't have been the Christian church. So actually, Judas is central to the Christian myth. And the other thing I find interesting about the Judas character is I went to see very early on, when it was first released, the musical Jesus Christ Superstar, which I think is incredible. I saw it in London in one of its initial runnings, and it's in that musical where the character of Judas is really explored as this guy that is devoted to Jesus, but actually betrays him because he thinks that Jesus has betrayed everybody else. And I think that was a really interesting idea. And one more thing I'll share with you, most of you think I'm a bit of a movie buff. There is a very interesting Dracula movie. I know I've gone from Bible through to Judas, through to Jesus Christ Superstar, and now I'm in the Dracula movie. But there's a very interesting Dracula movie in the 80s, I think it was, where the character Dracula is depicted as he became Dracula, a vampire, because he was Judas. And I think that was a really interesting idea of the way the villains morph. Okay. But in this gospel, Judas is the only one of the 12 disciples who truly understand Jesus' nature. He perceives the divine being within the human teacher, which I think is interesting when we consider what the church teaches us about Judas. And in the Gospel of Judas, we understand that Jesus asked Judas to betray him so that everything else will unfold as it should. Handing himself over his body frees his divine spirit. So betrayal means that it becomes a willing sacrifice, not an unwilling sacrifice. And in this gospel, we hear about how Jesus laughs at his 12 disciples for their apparent sort of superficial knowledge of what's going on. They worship the wrong God, the demiurge, and not the true Father. And if you read some of the Gospels, the 4 Gospels in the Bible, that sense is there that, people are being misled by false prophets, false idols, and some of Jesus's message is about reconnecting to the Father. The bit about nobody comes to the Father save through me is a later Christian gloss which re-establishes the church's authority. The discussions about this text are really interesting because although it's easy to suggest that the Gospel of Judas portrays Judas as the hero in this because of, he needed to do it, I needed to do it. I think that when it considers what happened to Judas, whether he did he hang himself because he couldn't live with what he'd done, or did he hang himself to liberate himself? And that's where the text becomes really interesting to try and unpick. And what I love about all of this stuff, by the way, is that you can read it and this stuff at face value and go, oh yeah, I know. However, it's not asking us to read it face value. It's asking us to study it, Gnostic Gospels, wisdom and knowledge. All right. And so we have to understand what may not be a straight line interpretation here, may simply be a codified piece of information. There are others that are really interesting, and we won't go into that, but there's the Apocryphon of John, which is the nature of God. There's the Thunder, which is about the perfect mind. It's a poem about identifying paradoxes in our lives. And I am the whore and the Holy One, possibly linked to the idea of Sophia, who was a priestess of Isis and all that kind of stuff. There's the Gospel of the Egyptians, talking about the great invisible spirit through Seth, what is Seth? There's hypostasis of the archons. That's not a Star Trek episode, although it is a Star Trek episode, but it tells Genesis about how the archons create Adam and Eve, but are outwitted by Sophia's divine spark within Eve. And so the archons, the messengers of the demiurge, create Adam and Eve to go, there you go, we've created stuff, we're better than God, and therefore these people are ahead of us. And the serpent becomes the hero, telling Adam and Eve to eat of the tree of knowledge, which then identifies the pure spark within them. And of course, in the surviving biblical texts, they are banished from the Garden of Eden because they know no God's secret. Well, they now know the demiurge's secret, perhaps. There's a dialogue, which is a post-resurrection dialogue about the Sophia, and she's fallen from grace, and she's got to be redeemed. And so, yeah, I won't go into that. And then there's idea about the three steles of Seth are really Aristotle and Plato's discussions. Well, not their discussions, it's presented as discussions between them, and looking at the sophistication of the biblical stories, not the fairy story of the biblical stories. So that's a quick outline of some of the texts. And again, I would, if this interests you, I would recommend you go and dig them up. There is a number of websites that offer free PDF translations of these. Be aware that not all translations are created equally, and in the translations from some Aramaic, some early Greek into English, there are obviously mistranslations and oversimplifications, which is why this is a philosophical journey into these Gospels rather than a historical one when you really get into them. And again, philosophy is about knowledge and wisdom. So why do these Gospels matter? Let's face it, since the Council of Nicaea, they've been declared, the ones that we knew existed, declared as heretical. The the groups that followed these particular doctrines were wiped out, basically. There was the ongoing discussions about, Jesus as a material character. Did he own stuff or didn't he own stuff? In fact, that's the whole idea behind a couple of interesting stories about this thing, which you can find yourself. I'm trying to think of the name of the rose. That's the book where they talk about this kind of thing as a pretext to some kind of murder mystery that goes on there. But these texts do represent the lost voices of early Christianity, the ones that were squashed out by the regime. And I call it regime, and that's no disrespect to fellow Christians. It's just about the fact that the politics of religion is important to understand, as well as the spiritual message of religion and the historical context of religion. And because the Bible was created and edited and structured to produce a coherent theme, a set of traditions, these Gospels say, well, it wasn't that simple. It wasn't that simple. In fact, it makes sense, doesn't it? If there has been a teacher, a spiritual teacher having impact in an area, and suddenly that teacher is martyred or murdered, everybody's going to have a different perspective on what he was trying to get through. And again, without too many film quotes, that's why The Life of Brian is such a brilliant Monty Python comedy, because it depicts that whole era about why was he crucified, who crucified him, what was God's cause, was there a cause, was he more than a prophet, was he really divine, are we all divine? These are the questions. The other reasons that the Gnostic Gospels matter is they not only suggest, but they highlight the women's authority in the church, particularly because of Mary Magdalene and her Gospels, and that attributed to her. She is given absolute authority. She was the best of the disciples, even though the church managed to sort of reduce her to a scarlet woman. And so these Gnostic Gospels matter because it talks about this femininity, the power of feminine knowledge and awareness. The Gospels are important because they show early Christian thoughts got mixed up with Greek ideas, Plato's ideas, and Egyptian religions. It became a potpourri, what's in this word? A potpourri of different beliefs. And that's what religion has always been, as far as I'm concerned. Any Orthodox religion is about the synthesis of what came before it, turned it into a new set of stories for a new audience. And we can claim in the early times that it was the people who traveled a lot who brought snippets of what they knew and believed, added it to snippets of what other people knew and believed, and created a new set of stories. It's all a story, but we end up with one that we believe and forget all the stuff, the origins of that story. We forget that, in the Gilgamesh tales from the Sumeria, we have the flood, we have the battle of good and evil, and those themes are repeated in the Christian Gospels and in other spiritual texts as well. Why are they repeated? Because they're human. They speak to the human need to find ourselves within ourselves. And that's why these stories are so important. It's because we know that these existed. We also know that the Council of Nicaea, which was 325, I think I said 60 AD before, I forget that, my head going weird, 325 AD, we know the Council of Nicaea had to sit down and form an orthodox story. And that's exactly what they did for whatever reasons. The Gospels are important because of historical scholarship, but also because textual, where we get these ideas from. There's a wonderful idea that explored in philosophy. So how do we know what we know? And we very rarely ask that question. Or maybe it's just me that didn't ask that question until I was made aware of it. I think in the New Age movement we see at the moment, for example, there's a lot of borrowed ideology from all over the place. But you try to sit down with somebody and say, well, how do you know what you know? Where did that come from? And try to unpick the tapestry that is what they of their belief. It's hard work, and people don't want to do that. They prefer to hide behind what they see as their own orthodoxy. So the Gnostic Gospels remind me that if Christianity, which is probably one of the most dominant religions in the world, next to Islam perhaps, then if the Christians can't tell you where their ideas came from, that tells you that it's not about knowledge anymore or wisdom. It's about blind faith and belief. And the Gnostic Gospels are constantly being revisited by people who are looking for something else. And I actually think that it's this drive of ourselves to discover ourselves that takes us to texts like the Gnostic Gospels and to early Gnostic Christian sects, where we realize that these sects, not sects, were based upon other founding principles. And that's quite important to remember. So, what can we say almost in sort of wrapping this little chat up? We know that this is a timeline of suppression and discovery. So we know from very early on, they became to be censored, squeezed out, ignored. And in 325, the Council of Nicaea just suppressed all of them. They were all considered to be heretical. Any discussion about heaven being within or God being within was translated in differently, and there became an orthodox line. And if you've ever been to a Christian church service of any persuasion and you've listened to what the preachers have said and what the readings have become, it is all about this. You're not worthy. You've got to come through the priesthood or the church in order to find your salvation. And actually, salvation isn't the idea, it's awakening is the idea with Gnosticism. We look at this timeline and then we see the discovery in 1955. And I actually think that's kind of interesting because when they were discovered and then they weren't translated for 20 odd years, but they came to be translated in English anyway, at a time when there was a spiritual awakening going on within the West particularly. They'd been through that kind of hippie stuff and they were coming out the other side, and this stuff fell on ears that were ready. However, I believe that many of the ears that this stuff fell upon became people who wanted to codify it even more and create it as yet another chain to stop us looking, which is one of the reasons why when I spoke about occultism, or when in the book that's just come out on occultism that I've written, the emphasis is always about self-discovery. It's always about finding your divine spark. And that's how Gnosticism has survived and been transformed into the occult movement. Because what's hidden is not the secrets of gods or planets, or what's been hidden is the secret of yourself. And it wasn't until, sort of the Gospel of Thomas wasn't really published till sort of late 2020s. Sorry, I can't be right. 2006. And that means that it's still being discovered by people. And because it's still being discovered, the message behind it is also now resonating with a whole new generation of people. Unfortunately, and I say this unfortunately, taking these individual Gnostic Gospels out of the context of the Christian church may not be the best idea, because I think I'll own it, I need to understand where these Gnostic Gospels fitted within the earlier Christian sects, like the Ebionites, the Marcionites, sects that we're not taught about in schools. But when you start to look at what they really believed and how they changed some of the narrative of Jesus, you can see the thread of Gnosticism through all of those, and that's where the gold is, that will shine your light to your inner soul or inner being or whatever. I think this is just a list of texts if you really wanted to start digging the research for yourself. There is an interesting idea that Carl Jung funded the purchase and the translation of the Codex. It's called the Jung Codex. And he saw Gnostic mythology as a confirmation of archetypes and the collective unconscious. Interesting take. Don't necessarily buy it directly, but see it and connect to it. And I would mention Dan Brown's Da Vinci Code, and even his Dark Materials, Philip Pullman's Dark Materials, and The Matrix, from The Matrix, heavily influenced by some of the Gnostic ideas, if not the Gnostic Gospel specifically, Gnosticism as a system of thought and belief that goes back to early Christianity and before. And again, you can get the text, download them, have a look at them. I recommend spend a couple of weeks of luxury relaxation time just reading these things and pondering them, and see where it takes you. So what's the key takeaway here? Well, Christianity was influenced by politics and party. That's it. All right. And it drew upon much earlier texts and beliefs and attitudes about this teacher or Jesus Christ. Yeah. And the Gnostic Gospels and the Gnostics had a worldview that was markedly different from the Christian view that we are presented with now. I think it's fascinating to consider the role of, let's say, Satan in the Christian church. The idea of Satan, well, Satan or Shaitan did not exist in the early Bibles. In fact, as Satan or as the devil worship or the devil didn't exist like that. Satan was actually the adversary of God as a testing mechanism. And I think what has happened is the church, because it was powerful, created a set of stories to do with Satan, and created a set of stories to do with the the kind of hell and where you go to, and purgatory and all of that sort of stuff. And I see that as a reaction to stop the Gnostic ideas taking hold, because they ask too many powerful questions. If God is good, why does he let bad things happen? That's a moral question that goes right the way back to anybody who's indoctrinated or introduced to Christian thought. If God is inherently good, and of course the answer is because humans have free will, and humans use free will for selfish ends, blah, 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 blah. Well, the Gnostics would say, well, God is good. It's the demiurge that screws with us. It's this false God that produces the material world. And whilst the material world may be beautiful, it's beautiful because we recognize the spark of the original God within everything. And when we can see that spark, when we can attune to that spark, we allow ourselves to, I want to try and avoid the word transcend, allows ourselves to connect with the original source. And that would be the goal of a Gnostic.